with you, Cody. How did it go this year? Give us the sort of the brief overview of the year for you.
Well, I mean, I'll say this season certainly exceeded my expectations. I raced my longest season ever and my heaviest, 870.3 races. Went to Europe for the first time, raced outside of North America for the first time, raced in Mexico for the first time, and cracked the podium in 5 out of those 8 races. So I'm very pleased.
You know, you raced a lot with us a number of years ago, but that's a big step up to racing at that level. What's the biggest difference from, say, racing a competitive race here in Ontario versus going out and racing a much more competitive 70.3 race internationally?
Well, the depth of the field is certainly a difference, but you know, it honestly wasn't a very big step. With the MultiSport Elite Series we had here in Ontario, I was able to race 3 to 5 other very fast guys pretty much every weekend. And so going on to international competition, suddenly it was 10 or 20 or 30 very fast guys, but I'd already had that experience against elite competitors. So
the experience here in Ontario, and we do pride ourselves on having great races. We're a little bit biased here with MultiSport Canada, but that was helpful for you.
Oh, tremendously! Yeah, it was a perfect stepping stone to bridge that huge gap between being a top age grouper to being a professional who's actually earning a living at the sport. It's not a binary thing when you go pro and start earning a living, so it was really nice to have a clear stepping stone racing elite in Ontario first, and getting my feet wet with that elite competition, and trying me to move up to international competition and find success pretty quickly in my first year as a pro.
Awesome. And I'm sure there were highs and lows. That's a lot of racing that you did this year. What was the high? Well, let's start with the low point. We'll finish with the high. What was the lowest point of the year for you?
Well, there was a clear low point. I targeted the World Championships in Austria, 70.3 World Championships as my A race of the season, and I invested 3 months, really poured my heart and soul into this build, into that race. Showed up with personal best fitness, really ready to go, and swam reasonably well. I was moving up through the field on the bike, rode the big climb very well, and on the descent, had a front tire blowout. And so my handlebars started to shimmy at about 60 kilometers an hour, and I managed to stay on the road and got a wheel pretty promptly from neutral support and was back going again after just 2 to 3 minutes on the side of the road. But I watched about 10 guys that I just suffered to pass on that climb fly past me on the descent, and you know, my nerves were so frayed at that point that the rest of the race, I finished 21st. I'm glad I finished, but I showed up and didn't make any secret about the fact that I was targeting a top 10. So that was pretty disappointing.
That was the low point. What was the high point? What was the best moment of the season for you?
You know, I think the high point had to be my first professional win at 70.3 Eagleman back in June. It was a pretty solid field. We had TJ Tullochs in there and Jordan Rapp, who were both former North American Ironman Pro champions. And I think I've had the fitness to deliver a performance like that for a while, but I suffered a long time with this idea of not really belonging in the pro ranks. Guys like TJ and Jordan that I mentioned, those are veteran pros with a resume that is pages and pages long, full of incredible accolades. I was a nobody compared to them. Not only was I several years younger, I didn't have their resume, I didn't have their experience, and so psychologically I think it was a huge step to be able to look in the mirror that morning before the race and really believe I can beat these guys. And so that was fundamental. I think I had the fitness, but I just didn't have that confidence and that sense of belonging in the pro ranks.
And where, at the micro level, where in that race did you know you had it? Like, there's a transition that happens, not the transition from, you know, swimming to cycling to running, but the transition from being the person that's chasing that athlete in front of you to knowing you're out in front of the race, and now they're chasing you, and you know you've got the win, and you're feeling confident. When did that happen?
I mean, we can get into the details of the race, but really I felt like the psychological heavy lifting was done well before the race. And I had this back and forth with my coach, and I said, you know, I think I can win this race. And he said, or I think my wording was, I think I can win this race if I'm having a good day. And he said, you know, that's good confidence, Cody, but you're still hanging on to this conditional statement, this if, and this thinking you can do something. It's not decisive, it's not confident enough. So he challenged me to be able to say, I will win this race. And I don't want to come across as cocky or overconfident, but you really have to believe you can look at the start list. In fact, I used to avoid looking at start lists just because it was intimidating. But in order to win a race, I think you have to be able to look at the start list and honestly believe that you could beat everyone on it. So by race morning, I was able to look in the mirror and say, I will win this race. And after that, the race itself felt like going through the motions. I swam well, I executed my plan of smashing the bike course and taking Andrew Starkowitz's bike course record, and then I posted the fastest run split. But psychologically, I'd done the hard work before the race.
Note that, folks, he broke Andrew Starkowitz's bike course record. Andrew Starkowitz, if you don't know him, and no, it's not the real Starkey, it's, Andrew Starkowitz is notable for being one of the fastest cyclists in the whole of the sport of triathlon. So that's the level of record that Cody broke on that course. What's it like to have locally, as either athletes that you get to race regularly or train with intermittently, Alexander van der Linden, Alex is with us here today, and also Lionel Sanders. You've known those guys for years. You butt heads at races. You train together occasionally. What's it like to have that quality of an athlete nearby?
Well, as I alluded to before, without racing those guys once or twice a month over the last couple of years, 2012 to 2014, I wouldn't have been primed to step onto the world stage and start performing well. It was really fundamental to my development to be able to race every weekend. If I'd been showing up at local races and walking away with an easy win by 10 minutes, that wouldn't have been good for my development. Instead, I was showing up and getting spanked by Lionel and getting pushed by guys like Alex and Mikael and others. So that was tremendous.
Awesome. And we're really on a bit of a roll long course right now. I mentioned them in my opening remarks. Lionel, Brent McMahon, Jeff Simons on the women's side, Heather Wordle, Angela Nath. We're on a bit of a roll with long course racing internationally. How you got the local push, but how inspiring is it to see those athletes winning and placing in the big international races around the world?
Oh, it's really inspiring. It's very cool to be part of this groundswell of new Canadian talent in long course. Kind of feels like being part of the new guard because most of us are on the younger side of things. So that's really interesting. There's also, I'm friends with almost all those guys, I know them well, but there's also often a race within a race to be the first Canadian, which is kind of exciting as well. There's some real competition between all of us.
Well, we certainly saw that in Hawaii in terms of what I was talking about before. I know that, unfortunately, I don't know if you know the story, Heather Wordle had a mechanical issue. She crashed on the bike early on, was taken out of the mix. She definitely, could have been top 5, legitimate contender for top 5 in Hawaii. And then Angela Nath came down with a foot injury and had to pull out after the bike. But she was on, I think she was off the bike in 5th or 6th place. So definitely right there. And on the men's side, I told the story about Jeff, of course, the crazy 30K ride with one leg, and Brent finished 9th. And Lionel was 13th. Give us your critique of how the men did anyways at Ironman Hawaii and what it might mean for the future.
Well, as you said before, we had serious hope for a top 5 or a top 10 among 3 of those athletes on the men's side and probably a couple other on the women's side. So I think it was a disappointing day for the Canadians, no doubt, it goes without saying almost. But there were some flashes of brilliance in that race, like Jeff Simons' run, and Lionel also ran very well. He figured out how to execute well in the heat for the first time. So I think that in future years, this bodes well for really strong Canadian performances at Kona.
And yourself, let's that leads to my next question, which I'm going to ask. You did really well at the 70.3, and really the next step. But it is physiologically, it is a big step to double that distance and then expect the same level of performances. When might we see you at the full Ironman, or at least that kind of length of race?
Well, that's a question that I've had in pretty much every interview this year, and I'm glad you didn't use the wording "step up to the full distance," implying that it's somehow greater. It is the pinnacle of our sport. That's where the most media attention and fan attention is focused. But I'm having a blast with 70.3 racing right now. I'm just 25 years old. I'm already on the young side to be performing well at 70.3, and I don't plan to touch Ironman for at least the next 2 seasons. So possibly age 27 or 28 in 2017 or 18, I'd start to look at Ironman. But in the meantime, there's a lot of things I really enjoy about 70.3 racing. As I said, I got to race 8 times this year, which is a lot of fun. And financially, that's my reality now that I'm earning a living from professional triathlon. I would say my earnings prospects are probably better in 70.3 right now. I'm not putting all my eggs in 1 or 2 baskets with a big Ironman performance that I need to do really well at every year. Instead, I'm hedging my bets by racing 8 times. So that if I have a disappointing day like 70.3 Worlds, it's disappointing, but it's not a huge financial blow because I can go and back that up with a race the next weekend.
That's the advantage, is you can race quickly after that, whereas Ironman you're down for a month or more. Brent didn't do his first Ironman, and Brent's in mid to late 30s now. He's getting on in years. He didn't do his first Ironman until last year. It was the first time he did. Just laughing at the age jokes.
He's a baby.
He's a kid, actually. Now, I've known Brent. I lived in Vancouver, and Brent's special. Everyone talks about him being an overnight success story, and they're talking about you and that same thing. But Brent's been racing triathlon since he was 12 years old. I remember him as a kid racing the youth and the junior races in Vancouver when I was living in Vancouver. So it was no overnight success, folks. That guy's been at it for a long time. And no shame about the 71.3. Craig Alexander, the great Craig Alexander, told me that he felt the most competitive distance in the world should be the 70.3 race, the half sort of Ironman distance. That's kind of the meeting point for all the great athletes in the world. You've done a great job. Any comment on that?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, you were kind of implying that the dynamics of 70.3 racing are so exciting to be part of. I mean, I haven't raced an Ironman yet, but my sense is that there's a lot more introspection, retreating inwards during the race. You're spending a lot of the race just fueling or slogging away at the miles. 70.3 racing at the pro end, at least, you're on the rivet the whole time and you're responding to the tactical demands of the race. So I really love that aspect of it.
It's much tighter racing. I mean, you see going deep into the bike, 10, 15, sometimes 20 men that are all in contention getting off the bike. So it's a little bit like ITU racing in that regard. It's still draft, you're not allowed to draft, but I've seen that stream of cyclists, 10, 15 plus riders all coming to the end of the bike ride together, and then really you're going to have to run fast. I mean, you're going to have to run 110 or better to be a factor, correct?
It is starting to look a lot like ITU racing, you're right, and I think as we're nearing the end of this Olympic qualification period, we're going to see an influx of ITU athletes who realize they aren't going to make their nation's Olympic team. So that's something that I've had my eye on. It is a difficult transition though. I think some people pretend that, or they act like ITU athletes will sweep into long course and just walk away with all of our podiums and money and stuff. I haven't seen that. In Ontario, we had Taylor Reid as an ITU athlete who made the transition very successfully. But other athletes who on paper are physiologically far superior to me, if you look at like their 10K personal best, they've stood up the long course and I've raced them, and they've had lackluster performances, frankly. So I think people underestimate just how hard it is to make that switch. So I'm watching it with interest, but I'm not overly concerned that we're going to see ITU guys just walk away with all of our 70.3 medals.
How different was the training this year? Obviously a big step up in performance. Was there something in the training that was different this year? Tell us a bit about how that changed, or if there was. Maybe there was no change.
I would say the big change in my training actually occurred last year when I started working with my coach. Previously I was self-coaching and making all sorts of errors and was very inconsistent over the course of the year. And so just implementing proper periodization where I guess in the past when I was self-coached I'd plug away with more or less the same training load week after week, which is a pitfall that a lot of athletes fall into. So working with a coach, there's some weeks when I'm practically begging him to let up. And there's other weeks where I'm begging him for more when I'm just sitting on my butt the whole week, it feels like. So that's been a big improvement. The composition of my training, I know polarized training is a big buzzword. Raise your hand if you've heard of polarized training. Just a few people, okay. Yeah, so
that's not training with a polar monitor,
no.
That's
No.
polarized training.
Yeah, we won't get into the details of that, but essentially the intensity at the high end of my training has become a lot higher. I spend very little time actually working at the intensities that I race at. So I think my training would actually look a lot more like an Olympic distance athlete's training than an Ironman athlete.
And what are you doing in the off season? What does the off season, quote unquote, look like for Cody Beals?
Well, I just heard someone describe it as the low season, which I think is a much better descriptor than off season. As you might guess, there's very few weeks, or if any, when I'm not training at all. So I said it was a very long, hard season. I finished the season with my first running injury ever. Promptly stepped off the red-eye flight home and got really sick for a couple weeks. And that was not altogether unexpected. I was kind of hanging things together with, by a thread, I guess, towards my last few races. So I took 3 weeks very easy, just some light swimming and a little bit of jogging and cycling whenever I felt like it. And now it's just a gradual build back up into 2016.
When's your first race for next year? When are you targeting to sort of make your debut in the 2016 season?
You can pretty much race year-round now in triathlon, but that's not advisable, of course. So I'm resisting the temptation to start racing again as early as January, February, or even March, perhaps. I'm looking at the South American 70.3 championships in Brasilia at the beginning of April. I really want to target a couple 70.3 regional championships this year as my A races. So possibly the North American one in St. George and the South American one, and maybe even venture over to Europe again as well.
Is there pressure to sort of get back into it, and it's almost like holding yourself back? I remember, Brett Sutton was talking about why the thing that he had to do the most with Chrissy Wellington was he had strong biceps, was Brett's phrase, because he had to hold Chrissy Wellington back in terms of the racing and the training. Is that something you have to be conscious of as well, or is that more coming from your coach?
Oh, exactly. I mean, I think that's typical among high-level athletes, is that they need to be reined in. And I joke with my coaches, they're like my drug dealers and I'm a crack addict, and they have to meter out the supply of training and racing very carefully, because if left to my own devices, I just go off the rails and binge and race too much and train too much and be a complete wreck.
Is there one bit of advice that you learned this year that you could pass on to the people in the room? A lot of these people in the room are very good athletes in their own right, but is there one thing you learned this year that you could pass on to make the people in the room maybe a little bit better?
I think I'd actually like to flash back to last year, my first pro race at 70.3 Texas. And I guess I looked pretty petrified at the start of the race. And you talked about Jeff Simons before, he was a really nice guy, so another Jeff Simons story. He was also racing that day. And
there's always stories with Jeff.
Yeah, he's a great guy.
We know Jeff.
So he came up to this really scared 24-year-old pro at his first race and shook my hand. And he said, without unsolicited, he just offered one piece of advice. He said, the guys are never as far ahead as you think they are. And even if you're in a bad spot in the race, don't get mentally dejected, remain focused, because even if you can't see them up on the horizon, they're never as far ahead as you think they are. And as a swimmer who's often coming out with the chase pack, a couple minutes back from the leaders, that's something I have to remember. It's easy to not see anyone up on the bike course in front of you and kind of give up hope and just say, okay, well, this day is done. But if you stay on it, more often than not, you can surprise yourself with what you're going to catch. So I think that's advice that's applicable at the pro level, but also to complete beginners as well. If you're racing, you can always, they're never as far ahead as you think.
Words of wisdom from Jeff Beals, or
Jeff
Simons, via Jeff Simons by Cody Beals. That's awesome. Big round of applause. This guy's done great this year, folks.